Well done. Yeah, as per usual, if you would like to ask Kate any questions, please just drop them into the chat box. I've got a couple of questions which people have given me in advance, which I'll come to when Kate's finished speaking. And then Mark Crothall's very kindly agreed to join us also. Mark's, as I'm sure most of you are aware, is Chief Executive of the Scottish Tourism Alliance. So Mark will also be giving us a bit of an update from a Scottish perspective as we sort of lurch on in our sort of semi-lockdown in Scotland, or more than semi for most. But Kate, without further ado, can I hand the floor to you, and perhaps you could give us all a bit of an update as to the latest state of play, direction of travel, and where you think the road is leading at the moment.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. And I'll focus on England, as Mark's here to do a Scottish update, so that we can pick up on that. I can pick up on anything to do with Wales and Northern Ireland, where there's a sort of also a fluid situation. I think, unfortunately, we are probably joining you in Scotland in sort of having restrictions in England, which mean that we're open in name only, but potentially could result in a large number of businesses feeling that they need to close or being unviable with the restrictions that are in place. So I'm going to touch on that, look at the regulatory timetable, and set out the other key announcements we're expecting over the next week, which may still influence the shape and scope of what I'm about to talk to you about. Touch on the sort of discussions centrally with all four devolved administrations around Christmas, and then pick up on today's announcements about Global Travel Task Force, quarantine, mass testing and vaccines, which look towards reopening and allowing greater activity in the spring, and then pick up just briefly on where we are in pressing for support for the sector. So we have yesterday's announcement about reopening plans for England from the 2nd of December. And it's likely that those restrictions will, although the restrictions end on the 3rd, it's likely the new restrictions will take effect from the 2nd. So for anybody who is able to reopen, it will be from the 2nd, not the 3rd as was previously planned for. We are moving back into a 3-tier system, but tiers 2 and tiers 3 substantially strengthened. And you will find that for most businesses in those areas, we're coming out of lockdown in name only. The restrictions are quite severe and have been tightened up since the last tier system 6 weeks ago. These tiers will be lasting until the end of December. It'll be that 28-day period, and then they'll be subject to review. But a clear signal yesterday from the Prime Minister that restrictions will remain in force and the tier system will remain in force until March. You might have changes within that and people will move up and down tiers, but the tier system itself remains in place until March. So significant tightening. So timetable wise, we are expecting, today was the announcement about quarantine and travel, which I'll come on to tomorrow, or today we may get an announcement about the plans for Christmas for the 4 devolved administrations, where they're looking at a harmonised link. And then these restrictions will be put to the House of Commons. On Thursday, we'll announce which tiers people will be in, so which parts of the country will be in what tier, put to the House of Commons. The regulations will be published on Monday, debated and approved on Tuesday, and will take effect on Wednesday. So that's the timetable we're working towards at the moment. In terms of the tiers themselves, there is some good news and some bad news. The good news at the bottom end, the relaxation is a little bit more. So good news in tier 1, people will be able to gather in groups of 6, indoors and outdoors. You can travel freely, you can go to pubs, bars and restaurants with family and friends. You're not restricted to just your own household. And crucially, that curfew, last orders now at 10 o'clock, a dispersal period of a full hour afterwards, something that we can use in Scotland and in other parts of the country as well, to be able to argue for a more relaxed approach. 10 o'clock last orders, 11 o'clock clear. So you can now have a second sitting at dinner for restaurants. So for those parts of the country that will be in tier 1, broadly pretty much where we were in September, and travel restrictions don't apply there. Tier 2, however, much more substantial restrictions. and effectively the restrictions on eating and drinking out are what we had in tier 3. So previously these restrictions only applied in Manchester and Liverpool, where you had tier 3 and the highest restrictions, now going to apply anywhere that is in tier 2. The biggest change there is that if you are a pub or a restaurant, you must only sell alcohol along with a substantial table meal. That also applies in hotels. So you can't just go into a hotel bar and drink. If you are in tier 2, you need to have a substantial table meal. We're working on the definition of what a substantial table meal means. Also in tier 2, you are only allowed to socialize in your household. So the restriction there means that you've got 2 restrictions that limit the ability to trade quite considerably. The curfew, last orders at 10 and a 1 hour drinking up time still applies in tier 2. And we're asking whether the ability to have up to 6 people, mixed households outdoors, also means that you can have a drink without a table meal outdoors. That might be some marginal change. And then in tier 3, effectively you are closed. In tier 3, hotels can only reopen if they are for business travel and there is a travel restriction, avoid travel into and out of the region unless it's for business purposes, and bars and restaurants, it's takeaway only. So the facilities are closed. In a hotel, that means that the amenities are closed in terms of the spa, the gyms, etc. But also the bars and the restaurants need to be closed and takeaway only. So quite severe restrictions and effective closure in tier 3. So that's why we wait to see quite urgently on Thursday who's in what tier and how you can move in and out of tiers, because tier 3 really very restrictive. The good news as it comes, limited amounts. We do have business events, business functions now reopening and at quite large levels as well. For business events, tiers 1 and 2, spectator sports, business events allowed to resume indoors and outdoors with capacity limits. So it's roughly 50% of your normal capacity, up to a maximum of around 1,000 or 4,000, depending on the type of activity. Tiers 1 and 2, weddings and funerals can go ahead, but strict restrictions on number of attendees. 15 people at the wedding reception and ceremony, 15 people at 30 people, sorry, at a funeral and a wake. No events in tier 3, however. So those are the broad parameters of what we're looking at. And also in tier 3, I should just say, it's not just pubs, bars, restaurants and hospitality settings are closed. You've also got indoor entertainment and tourist attractions closing, bowling alleys, skating rinks, amusement arcades, escape rooms, those kind of attractions, and indoor attractions at outdoor venues. So zoos, safari parks, wildlife reserves, gardens, they can all stay open, but the indoor bits must close in tier 3 only. So those are the main areas that we're looking at. We don't have clarity yet as to how and when and how frequently those tier geographical boundaries will be reviewed. They clearly get the data on a weekly basis, but there is a real move from the government to be able to restrict what is happening, and a fear factor about what might happen in the run up to Christmas and New Year, which is why I think our venues are remaining closed and severely restricted. We understand that the 4 devolved administrations are reaching an agreement on the treatment of Christmas, particularly around the lifting of travel restrictions, because there are very different travel restrictions across all 4 parts of the UK. Wales has restrictions for people from Scotland or England going into Wales from high-risk areas. Scotland obviously has the travel restrictions about not going past the border, and also travel restrictions within the locality, and England also has that. If you're in tier 3, don't travel outside the region and don't travel very much inside the region. We understand what they're aiming for as a landing space is a 5-day period during which time travel restrictions could be eased to allow families to meet up, and also that you will be allowed to look at festive bubbles, so that you can have a multiple household that will be able to come together. It will be fixed for that 5-day period, so you can't suddenly say you've got another bubble when you're coming down. You know, if I, for example, are traveling up to Durham, I can't have one 3 or 4 household bubble in Durham and another 3 or 4 household bubble in London. You have to fix it in advance. We understand the areas of debate and disagreement between particularly the First Minister in Scotland and England is around the number of days that will apply. I think England would be happier to have a longer period. Scotland want to have a very tightly defined period, and the number of households that are in that bubble. And again, Scotland wants to be narrower than England. So that is still a matter for debate, but the principle of having a festive period where you've got deregulation, and I understand that includes deregulation not just in people's houses, but a temporary suspension as well of restrictions on hospitality. That broad principle is agreed by all 4 devolved administrations, and they were hoping they would have an announcement today or tomorrow. In terms of the Global Travel Task Force, this has been meeting at pace for the last 6 weeks, and we've been actively involved in that work. This is about how you can free up and try and get more international travel moving. Recommendations to the Prime Minister to boost international travel have been announced today, and that is a test and release scheme which will come into effect on the 15th of December. This means that passengers travelling into England from high-risk countries, those that are not on our travel corridor list, and that is both international travellers but also people returning from foreign travel to the UK, will be able to take a test. They have to pre-book it. It's a private test. They have to go into isolation for 5 days on returning from a high-risk country, take a test on day 5, and then if it's negative, they will be able to exit quarantine and be able to resume normal life, resume their work. So clearly reducing the amount of time that people have to take steps to remain quarantined helpful, and could also be used if it's proved to be successful, could be used to reduce the period of self-isolation for people who come into contact with a positive test at work, like the Prime Minister, where, you know, even though it's clear you've had the disease and you are negative, you still have to remain off work for the full 14 days at the moment. So this could be helpful. And then the other recommendations of the Global Travel Task Force report, looking at how you can boost international rail, tourism, hospitality and aviation, additional support for the aviation sector to make sure that the airports are supported so that they can participate in the recovery and we don't lose vital capacity, and also working with them on rapid and mass testing. And that's the final area that I wanted to touch on before we open it up to questions. The government is rapidly rolling out this mass testing approach that they piloted in Liverpool. Any areas of England that go into tier 3 will have extra funding to do mass testing of the whole population. That's designed to identify asymptomatic carriers, asymptomatic cases, those who are infectious before they realise it, so that you can get them isolated and you can stop the chains of infection. But it's also being looked at as a rollout, as an enabler to allow more parts of the economy to reopen in the new year, particularly around events, conferences, music venues, live music and theatre, all of which are able to open in December, subject to capacity constraints. But it is believed that over time you could have mass testing rolled out amongst the general population, where if you can demonstrate you're negative, you are allowed to go and participate in these events, and you can have tests before you turn up at the events to make sure that they are run safely. So that could see nightclubs and hospitality reopening from January. So those are the key areas that is coming through from today's announcements. And then the final point is around support. Treasury has a statement tomorrow, which is a spending review statement, unlikely to announce additional areas of support for COVID and additional funding, but it's possible there might be some signals in there going forward about VAT and business rates. More importantly, they've confirmed that the grants that currently apply in England will continue, and we assume that the commensurate measures will be taken to make sure that that grant funding is available in line with the Barnett formula for the devolved administrations. In England, that means £3,000 for premises in tier 1 and tier 2 who are subject to those severe restrictions, and that they have announced that it will be the same, tier 3, tier 2, you'll get the same amount of funding. Furlough will continue until March 2, and the other areas that we're talking to the government about are the CGRS bonus and replacing that with the retention incentive and getting that black hole in the cash flow plugged. And then secondly, dealing with the rent moratoria being extended to provide protections, and the debt enforcement moratorium in particular extended for those who are on mortgages as well, to make sure there's an extended time to pay and grants to cover those rent costs if we can achieve that. And the bigger points then, extension of the business rates holiday for a year and extension of the VAT cut for a year. I'm probably going to pause there because there's probably lots more detailed questions that people would want with specifics to try and flush out some of the issues that we've just touched on.
Thanks very much indeed, Kate. Wow, quite a lot to take on board in a fairly short period of time. So I'm sure there are some points of clarification. So let me just go to the chat box. Richard Ball from Calcutta Leisure asks, can you clarify that we can open on the 2nd rather than the 3rd of December from lunchtime? Is that correct? You're on mute.
Yes, yes, it is correct. Originally, they had said it will be reopening from the 3rd. They've now changed it in yesterday's announcement to say that the new regulations will take effect from 1 minute past midnight on the 2nd, and therefore you can reopen on the 2nd, both in terms of hotel bookings, but also bars, restaurants, facilities, etc. And all the hotel facilities open up in tiers 1 and 2. Clearly, the only difference to that will be in tier 3, where you won't be able to open up unless you've got just those limited facilities and capacities. And I think Richard's also added to the question of are business meetings and conferences limited by the rule of 6 in tier 1 and tier 2? No, they're not, as far as we are aware. You should only, if you're seating people, you should make sure they are socially distanced within that business meeting. And you should also make sure that if you've got them on individual tables where social distancing can't take place, so they're less than 1 meter or 2 meters apart, and they're sort of, you know, you're doing a theatre style event or a conference where you've got people round tables, or you've got business dinners and business events we think are okay to open, but we're getting the details. You should make sure that you've got no more than 6 on those tables, but you're not limited by the rule of 6 and the multi-household. The business event, it takes place in a different environment as long as they are socially distanced. So you can have more people. We think that the cap on business meetings of 30 has also been lifted because you've got business events taking place now, which can be up to 50% of the normal capacity of the room.
That's interesting. Okay, and so you think that provided you have the space, the restrictions have been lifted, so actually larger events can take place, but that doesn't apply to weddings or to funerals?
Doesn't apply to weddings and to funerals. There is limited logic to that, I understand. And we are urgently clarifying, because when they made the announcement about business events, they did talk about business events and conferences. So we do just want to make sure, double check that that also applies to our normal understanding of conference and banqueting and business functions. But it does look as though you would be able to have private dining, and it does look as though you would be able to have a business event operating within the COVID secure guidelines, provided you've got space and social distance on tables.
Okay, so Richard, actually, if you just bear with me 1 second, Kate. Richard also sent me a question in advance. I apologize, I've got another phone going off in the background, which I can't do anything about just a moment. Yes, Richard also asked, could you possibly clarify the new guidelines for exercise classes? It appears to be clear that they can resume, but does the rule of 6 have to apply? Because obviously they're not really viable to run for 6 people.
That might be one that I have to take away and double check with the announcements. I'm just seeing if I've got anything in my notes that I can look at. I think that's one I might have to come back to you about. I'm not terribly au fait with exercise classes. I'll see if I can find it while we're talking. My understanding is that they can resume certainly in tier 1. Tier 2 is more difficult, but the gyms can reopen and classes can restart in tier 1. But I will just double check with you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Robin Shepherd of Bespoke Hotels asks, can you please outline what you think will happen re-rent arrears? Will the government underwrite grants, do you think?
We've pushed them to do that. That's the solution we've put forward to them, to look at that accrued rent debt and to incentivize a landlord forgiveness of some of that rent debt by covering the costs of it. So far, the Treasury has resisted, but clearly we are in a very different set of circumstances now, and we'll retable that. But you know, it's going to be a hard push to get the Treasury to give additional grants. One other thing that they have talked to us about is the potential for swapping that rent debt from a commercial landlord, which falls due immediately in December, to a longer term low cost loan. Now I realize that doesn't solve the problem because it is just one form of debt for another, but it might mean that it's more manageable to pay off, and the Treasury is looking at how they can use the CBIL scheme and the bounce back schemes to be able to help with that one.
Thank you very much. There's a question here about, or a couple of questions about movement. Question from Tanya Lister at Carlskew Hotel up in Sutherland. How long are we likely to see the border in Scotland shut?
It's a very good question, and it's one that I can't really answer. I think you know, that's definitely one that Mark might be able to help more on, because it's much more from the Scottish government side than it is from the English government side, where they would want the border to be closed. I don't know whether, Mark, you want to come in on that now.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously everything's heading towards the 11th of December for that review piece. Tier 3, Tier 4, you know, travel is in law now, it's not guidance, and that's a big difference between what's down south. So that permission of travel through any of those tiers is arguably restricted until we've got to the 11th. But saying that, I was just on a call with David Horn from LNER, and of course they've got a direct train to Inverness. So if you're not getting off in Edinburgh, then potentially you're not traveling through any Tier 3 or 4 restrictions. So, but 11th is I suspect the likely review of that movement.
But yes, review rather than relaxation.
I think it's still, everything's up for review, Roddy. It's not, there's no guarantee of any relaxation yet. The only assurance we've been given is that Tier 4 will cease, but in the same way, the announcements of yesterday down south, we don't know which authority areas will end up in Tier 3, and because Tier 3 is in the legal travel piece as well, that could still find some of those areas into a level 3 authority area. The only movement that we know that will happen this week, from what's been said this morning, is East Lothian will go down to a Tier 2, but Mid Lothian have been told to stay in a Tier 3. Otherwise, I suspect there'll be no further change.
And I think,
thanks, Kate, I think you were...
those travel restrictions, clearly Scottish government and Welsh government taking a view on how effectively they think England is getting the virus under control before they'll lift any travel restrictions over the border. So in both cases, I think they're sort of doing a watch and see, and I think it will depend on which parts near the border are in which tiers in the UK. So, you know, if the northeast goes into Tier 3, you'll have more concerns about lifting that travel restriction into England, and ditto across with Wales.
And just still on the travel between tiers, can you clarify, Kate, what the sort of regulations are in relation to people traveling between Tiers 1 and Tiers 2?
Yes, there is no travel restriction. The only tier in England where there is a travel restriction, and it is advisory rather than legally binding, although that may change as well when we get the latest regulations out, is Tier 3. So you are not supposed to travel out of or into Tier 3. The travel restrictions between 1 and 2, there are none, and you take your restriction with you. So if you are in tier 2 and going into tier 1, you should stay within your single family. You shouldn't go and mix with another household in tier 2. If you're traveling from tier 1 into tier 2, you move into the new restrictions in tier 2. So you can't go out and have a drink in the pub, and you minimize the number of households you socialize with in tier 2. But you can travel freely between it. But you couldn't, for example, if you were, if say Liverpool and Manchester remain in tier 3, they couldn't travel to Devon for holiday. They may well be able to if we have this agreement around what happens over the festive period, the festive 5 days.
Okay, thanks. But if you were, just to clarify, if you were, I don't know, if you were in tier 1 or tier 2 and you wanted to go to another tier 1 or tier 2 area, could you travel through a tier 3 area to get there if you didn't stop?
Yes, if you don't stop, you can. So if you're in the Lake District, surrounded by tier 3 restrictions, people can still travel into the Lake District to get to you if the Lake District is in tier 2 or tier 1. As long as they don't stop in a tier 3 area, and as long as they're not coming from a tier 3 area. Other than that, you are free to travel. So I'm in London, I can go down to Devon and pick up my daughter at university, and that's fine.
Good. Okay, thank you very much. Changing tack slightly, Michael Gray asks, with the extension of the furlough until March, does this mean that the £1,000 per person for those jobs retained to January will be dropped, or is that something we're still lobbying on?
We're still lobbying on it. It has been dropped. It won't be happening in January, February. The Chancellor said he would come back with an alternative job retention incentive in the new year. We may get more details about that on Wednesday, but it will be at the end of the furlough period. So, you know, the Chancellor's view is furlough is supporting those jobs now. There will be a retention incentive. We wait to see what it will be. Our argument with the Treasury is we need that black hole plugging in February. So we need that payment being made. Can we draw it down early?
Okay, thanks. Just going back to the point about business meetings, Jane Longhurst from the Meetings Industry Association has just put a helpful comment up here. She says, my information from DCMS yesterday morning is that business events can take place, but they must follow the guidelines closely, and straying into social dinners, lunches, etc. is not permitted. So thank you very much for that, Jane. That was very helpful. We've got another question, this one from Gary Atkinson. Furlough was announced by the UK government effective from 1st November, applicable to all those on payroll up to end of October. England lockdown applied, Scotland remained open. What happens when local councils move into lockdown tiers, i.e. Scotland's Central Belt placed into tier 4 lockdown last Friday? Some businesses would have recruited employees during November, but with these November employees qualify for furlough as they were not on October payroll. I think I know the answer to the last bit of that, but did you get the gist of that?
Yes, I did. No, it's an absolute cut-off, the same as it was at the start of the furlough period. You have to have been on the payroll and part of an RTI submission by the 30th of October to qualify. So anybody taken on and probably from the early part of October, not having gone through an RTI submission, won't be able to be furloughed, won't be able to be included. Then it moves forward from the 1st of November through to the end of March. That furlough will flex. So if you are able to work and you have some hours, then people can work, and the government will top up on top of that up to a maximum of 80% of salary. And if you're fully closed, then you go back onto full furlough. They are 7-day reporting cycles. So you would tell people what their hours are for those 7 days, whether they're full or partial furlough, what their hours are, and then you can claim at the end of the month as per normal. So it's exactly the same rules as we had in August.
Okay, thank you. Could you just clarify for my benefit, did you say that the VAT relief has been extended to the end of next year?
No, the VAT relief is extended to the end of March. We're pushing for it to be extended to the end of the year, given that we're not coming out of lockdowns and restrictions until the end of March. It seems sensible to have the VAT cut extended so that we're not having to put prices up on Easter weekend.
And has there been, I mean, is there any mood music in terms of whether that is likely to be extended?
It's being taken into account at the moment by the Treasury. It's as part of their budget planning. We don't have a signal yet as to whether it's white smoke or black smoke, but it hasn't been ruled out.
Okay, thank you. Changing tack a little bit, looking forward, and we're moving slightly from the objective to the subjective here, but there's been quite a lot of press coverage recently about, obviously, about the vaccine, and comment now from the Prime Minister that by Easter, I think he's saying he anticipates that I think I read this morning that COVID restrictions will be lifted in their entirety. Can you comment generally on the sort of sense that you're getting from government at the moment?
That's their ambition. They would like sort of a lifting of restrictions entirely by March. I think if they can, they'll bring that further forward, but that seems to be tied into when they think most of the vaccines will be administered to the most vulnerable, and also when we move into finer, sunnier weather and more people can go outside. I don't think I necessarily trust them to mean that all restrictions will be lifted. I think they mean that the tier system will be removed and we'll be back to one national approach. But I can foresee a situation where we go back to the restrictions that we had in July for a little time longer. So we are pushing them on that to see what they mean. But I frankly don't trust necessarily the suggestion that we could be fully clear of this. So, you know, clearly there will be opportunities within the period between now and March to push for an end to some of the restrictions within the tiers, for more parts of the country to be moved down to lesser tiers, lesser restrictions. And I think the government would certainly have an ambition, if it looked as though we were back to a situation that we were in July, to move out of those tiers as quick as they can. But that seems to be their timetable, and their strategy does very much seem to be, we will now wait until the vaccine is out before we move it further forward and release restrictions.
And do you think that the government is in step with the scientific community in this regard, or are they sort of moving against the scientific community's advice?
I think the scientific community is more in the ascendancy than it has been before, and that's shown by the restrictions that they've got on hospitality. You know, most of the scientific community were against us reopening in July and felt that it was too early. Now that's the fact that then the scientific community in Scotland and Wales kept everybody in hospitality in lockdown for longer and felt it was safer that way to reopen later. It seems to be neither here nor there nor forgotten. But yeah, the scientific community, their view of getting the incidence of infection as low as practically possible before you start mass rollout of the vaccine is the scientific approach, and that seems to be what the government has gone back to following. Certainly,
okay.
Down the rollout of the vaccine if you have high levels of infection when you vaccinate the general population.
Thank you very much. Question from Stuart Broster, still slightly, well, it has the word vaccine on it, but a different sort of question. He says, now that vaccines are on the horizon, what funding is being proposed to get things moving after April? I mean, is the government looking to put more funding in place to encourage businesses to reopen and to enable the economy to get kick-started?
The Chancellor's certainly looking at that. I don't think we'll get much signal of it before the budget next year, in the early part of next year, probably around February. He has talked openly about measures to stimulate consumer confidence and to get recovery underway. And that's where I think VAT plays a key part in the deliberations. But at the weekend, he was talking openly about fiscal stimulus to get the economy moving again. And to get people back to work, back into office space and back to more normality. So we would just have to wait and see what they come up with on that.
Okay. We're erring into the political here. A question from Frank Croston of Hamilton Hotel Partners. How does Kate rate the government's handling of the pandemic on a scale of 1 to 10?
I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that one. I can, you know, Parson's egg, good in parts. Yeah, I think it's very difficult to simultaneously grapple with a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and a jobs crisis in such known circumstances and with such limited data that we've had. I think there's certainly things that could have been handled better. And communication particularly has been extremely poor since September. But I'm going to take a politician's answer and say it's too soon for me to give them their final grade for the year. I could only give an interim, which would be must work harder, must do better.
Thanks very much. We'll let you off the hook on that one. Charles Peru asks, do we know what's holding up the agreement and arrangements for Christmas? Surely it can't be that difficult, he says. We've been told they've been talking since the weekend. I'm sure most people can't wait to hear this.
Well, I think it goes back to what I said. They've been talking and they have broad agreement of principles. The Scottish First Minister wants a tougher and tighter regime of relaxation than the English government wants, and I think that that's what's holding it up.
I've been talking to one or two people over the last few days, and they seem to share a common view that post the 2nd of December, all major conurbations, all major cities are likely to end up in tier 3. Do you think there's any basis to that?
No, I don't think so. I think lots of the leaders of those areas are lobbying really hard to be in tier 2 rather than in tier 3. Certainly the signs look more positive for London and Birmingham to avoid going into tier 3. And I think, you know, Liverpool would certainly be energetically lobbying to come down into tier 2 as a sort of reward is the wrong word, but, you know, Liverpool has worked really hard on mass testing, has worked with the government, agreed to go into tier 3 and has been in tier 3 for a lot longer. I suspect you will get Manchester remaining in tier 2, Greater Manchester, tier 3, I should say. And that sort of Greater Manchester spread across into West Yorkshire is the area of the country that seems the most resistant to coming down. The only thing that people will do now is that if they go into tier 3, they've got more money to get local testing and they've got a commitment that they can come out of it as quickly as possible. So I don't think it's right to automatically assume that the major conurbations will go in. And I think, you know, the government and the Mayor of London are quite aware of the signal it would send to international visitors if London was to go into a lockdown.
Thank you, Kate. There's a question here, which I'm just going to put out there for everybody, actually, from Mark Fulton of Fuller's, who says, I would be interested, Fuller's Hotels, that is, I would be interested in hearing about how operators in the old tier 3 found opening under the substantial meal restrictions. As they're now tier 2 rules, some learnings case studies would be very interesting. If anybody would like to comment on that for Mark's benefit, pop a comment into the chat box, or if you'd like to actually respond to that verbally, just sort of put your hand up euphemistically and I'll let you in. But I think it might be an appropriate moment, Kate, just to pause if I can. Please don't go away if you can afford to stay till 11, because I'm sure there are one or two other questions which will come through. But if I may, I'll turn to Mark Crothall, Chief Executive of the Scottish Tourism Alliance, who's also very kindly joined us this morning, as indeed has Stephen Leckie, Chairman of the Scottish Tourism Alliance. But Mark, I'm hoping that you might be able to give us a little bit of an update as to latest state of play, north of the border, direction of travel, any glimmer of light at the end of tunnels, and anything else which you feel the assembled company would like to hear.
Thanks, Roddy, and Kate, and well done again on the Peach Icon Award last week. Highly recommend anybody on the call today to have a look at the that particular program that was delivered in the afternoon. Some really excellent insight and interviews to what lies ahead and what can be done. I suppose in answer to your question, you know, I touched on the fact that we are in a different timeline. So we sit really to the 11th of December as the the next big change. We've got 11 authorities in Tier 4 at the moment, which, as sort of Kate alluded to, is we're in the same situation, maybe in name. So really total lockdown for pretty much everything, apart from takeaway activity. And with Tier 3 as well, many of the other sort of key areas in the Central Belt, if not in Tier 4, in Tier 3, has largely restricted, or has restricted, movement across the whole of the country. So we're certainly making the point to government that whether you're in a Tier 1, 2, 3 or 4 position, you are heavily impacted as a result of that legal travel restriction now. So if you take Stephen, for example, in Crieff, his only audience is Perthshire, which clearly is a small pond to fish in when you're trying to fill large properties, let alone the number of other properties as well. We are, however, we saw our first live indoor event on a positive in Inverness, a folk rock occasion. Roddy, you'll be here to know the Torridon played to an audience of 98 people, all sat religiously, not doing anything that they shouldn't, which was great. So the north of the country has obviously enjoyed a slightly more relaxed situation, but again, it's all dependent on whether or not they can get the customers coming through and getting those bookings flowing. What is important to us, and I suppose coming back to much of what the voice has been south of the border, is for the industry to know sooner rather than later which tier they are likely to land in, and not it not be conveyed within a matter of days before we make that change, for reasons of supply chain, staffing, and all the other obvious ones. Businesses can prepare to open up in the best way possible. And also, the Christmas piece is critical as well. The First Minister's been very clear, I think, in her message yesterday that there will be definitely no relaxation at all over the New Year period. The only time of slight relaxation she'll entertain will be over that Christmas period. And I think Kate's made the point that the debate obviously sits around how relaxed that might be. We are, as you know, in Scotland, not allowed anybody in anybody's household at all at the moment in the Central Belt areas. So 6 from 2 households only can meet in a restaurant environment. So some of that change will be welcomed, but certainly it won't stretch into the new year. The hospitality groups have been doing a great job in, again, pushing for a change in the relaxation of the restrictions to try and get that extended extended hours of service to build in that second sitting through to 10 o'clock. There's been a lot of good voice put forward from a number of different bodies and individuals as well. So we very much hope that that change will come about when the review is taken. But really our focus now, as Kate alluded to, is to try and push forward to get the support into the sector as fast as possible. And you'll have had, as you know, Fergus Ewing on the call with the Recovery Task Force plan, plus heard from me in the past around some of the push and the proposals that the task force put forward for support mechanisms. But the Cabinet meet on the 1st of December to hear a set of recommendations around immediate support that can be agreed, hopefully, to go into the sector and delivered through a grant form, which is available to them already from the consequential that they've had as a result of their last announcement by the Chancellor. But it's not going to be enough. We know that it would just, again, be very much a token initial grant. So a lot of need to get more support in of a bigger amount over the course of the coming weeks and months. So really there isn't that much more we have. Going back, you touched on meetings and events. Again, there's divergence up here. There is no permission for meetings and events at the moment, yet we have a slight variance on weddings. We can accommodate 5 more people to our wedding receptions in Scotland. So if you've got 5 more friends and want to get married in Scotland, then we're slightly better than the South. The same for wakes as well. But we're now, as I say, waiting on this support piece. And the only change, as I said earlier, that we're likely to hear about today, the Cabinet meets on a Tuesday, so the announcement will come, will be the review of the one authority. So we're hearing which will be East Lothian going into a tier 2. It had been hoped that Mid Lothian may go into a tier 2 as well, but that's not the case. On the cities front, just going back to the question you posed to Kate, I think there was again, at the beginning, there was certainly reference to Edinburgh being in a better place than Glasgow in terms of potentially coming into a lower tier at exit point, but you know, that remains to be seen. Will that happen on the 11th? But there's not much more at this stage I can share with you. We'll continue to push, and we know that Fergus Ewing is doing his bit as well. We've obviously seen a change in our tourism Conservative representative. Oliver Mundell basically resigned his post on Thursday as well, stepping aside over him not favouring the travel legal travel decision that's been taken. So he's stepped down, and we await to hear who his replacement will be in the Scottish Conservatives as well. But I'll leave it at that. Happy to take any other questions. I think I might know the answer to the exercise piece, though, purely because my wife is in that field, as you know, and was telling me that I think the exercise class position is you can do it as your own household, but the more traditional classes such as body pump and that type of activity, dance classes, is not going to be possible. But if you have small group exercise events, so sort of personal training in pods, you are able to work we still deliver those within a social distancing way. So that, not that I attend any.
With a restriction on numbers, Mark?
I've just checked that as well in England. If you want to finish on Scotland, Mark, I've got the answer on exercise class.
Well, there's no classes up here at all apart from outdoor activity now, up to 30 outside.
Okay, so we have in tier 1, outdoor is okay, no maximum numbers, so you can have outdoor classes. Indoors, the exercise class, if the rule of 6 is followed, that doesn't mean that you have to have just 6 people, but you can have, you know, the rule of 6 within a larger room. So it'll depend on the size of the room and how you are managing that rule of 6. In tier 2,
sorry, Kate, just to interject there, just to clarify, meaning that you could have, for the sake of argument, 6 groups of 6 people if the room was big enough.
Yes. Yes, if you had sort of a spin class, for example, and you have a big exercise hall, not a small room, you could have 6 exercise bicycles and then a 2-meter gap and another 6. But you'd have to make sure that the rule of 6 could be followed in the changing rooms and all the way through. In tier 2, exercise classes, okay, outdoors. Indoor exercise classes, yes, they are allowed, but only if it's possible to absolutely avoid mixing with people you don't live with. So you're in your own little pod of people that you live with, you can do your exercise class, but you can't do it indoors if you've got that mixing of households in tier 2. So probably that means no exercise classes indoors unless it's sort of private tuition really, but that may come up in hotels. Tier 3, no group exercise indoors or outdoors.
Great. Well, hopefully that clarifies things for Richard. I just wanted to pick up on something which Mark mentioned there about the strategic recovery group. There is a survey which is being published by Visit Scotland in relation to this, and they've asked me if I would give a plug to the survey and ask as many people as possible to complete the survey. As everybody's aware, we send out a follow-up to these calls, and there will be a link in this week's follow-up to that survey. If you would be kind enough to complete it, if you could find the time, that would be very much appreciated by Visit Scotland. On a different note, but also another sort of plea, Jill Chalmers, who's a regular attender on our calls, I'm not sure if she's with us today, but she's written another letter to the First Minister on behalf of Scottish hotels, which he's hoping to actually present to her in person this afternoon. We did circulate a copy of this letter to everybody yesterday, I believe. She is looking for as much support as possible, just by way of people saying, yes, please, we're happy to support. If anybody is able to support, could they please just ping an email to jill.chalmers, CHALMERS, at glenapp, GLENAPP, castle.com. That's glenappcastle.com. So if you would like to support what Jill's trying to do on behalf of the Scottish Hotel sector, please just ping her an email and she would appreciate it greatly. Right. So I think we're sort of there in terms of questions. I'd like to just ask one or two people. I had a comment from Tanya Lister up at Carl's Skew a week or two back, when she said that of the 68 million people who live in Britain, she'd worked out that only about 1 million were allowed to actually come to her hotel. So it did make it sort of rather questionable as to whether it was worth staying open. Tanya, have you got a quick status update from what's happening in the Highlands? Are you still open or are you closing?
So morning, Roddy, morning everyone. Thanks to everyone for their content this morning. It's been really interesting. I'm sort of in quite a different situation, I think, up here, because we are still open, and miraculously, despite the fact that we've only got such a small pool of people that can even come up and see us, we're due to finish the month on about 82% occupancy, which is fantastic, and actually a record occupancy for us in November. So we're just incredibly fortunate, that's all I can say. We obviously had mass cancellations as a result of the restrictions that were introduced in November. And we've been sort of proactively cancelling those and getting in touch with those that have been coming from out with the lower tier areas, and actually we've been able to refill pretty much everything that we've lost and gain a little bit more. So yeah, we close on Sunday, well, Monday morning next week, which is what we plan to do anyway. But I have to say, we will have been incredibly pleased with how we finish up.
Thank you, Tanya. Bill Cross down at Cringlety House. Are you in business at the moment, Bill, or have you been forced to close?
No, we're closed at the moment, Roddy. We closed on the 8th of November, following the requirement that we not only not take bookings from all of England and those parts of Scotland in a higher tier than we are, we're in tier 2. But not only do we not take bookings from those areas, but we cancel any bookings that we've got. So that left us sort of pretty much empty for November. So I shut the doors.
Thanks very much, Bill. Peter Cashman, you've got hotels around the country as Focus Hotels Management, some in Scotland and more down south. What are your experiences at the moment? How are you faring?
Well, our policy has been to keep all our hotels open, irrespective of the circumstances around them. And we have the Collection in Stirling, of course, and that remains open for key workers, which is what it was. There's a little bit of income coming from that. Down south, yeah, the hotels are varying from 20% occupancy up to some of them doing up to 60% occupancy in some locations. But in principle, places like Heathrow and along the M4 corridor are very badly hit. And therefore, but our position will always be, we'll keep the hotels open. We'll keep them trading, even if it's only for key workers. We believe very strongly that that will allow us to come back to market quicker when we're allowed to for those hotels. So that's our position, and we will remain with that, and it's fairly successful for us. We operate at a loss, but that's life but at the moment. But we're taking a view that maybe we will be like that until March time, I think, at the best.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And Frank Croston, I see you're with us today. what's your sort of situation in relation to properties in the UK? Assuming Frank's still with us, he may not be. Nope, I'm guessing he's not. Good. Well, listen, I think we've had a pretty good round of it today. Kate, I don't honestly know how you managed to keep all the facts and information at your fingertips. I think it's extraordinary, and we're all hugely grateful to you for the work that you and your colleagues at UK Hospitality have been doing. You've done just a sterling job. I can only imagine it must be very frustrating at times, but equally, you have achieved an awful lot for us. So we're massively grateful. I suppose just a last question from me, you know, in terms of your sort of your positivity rating looking forward, do you think things are moving in the right direction, or do you still see many hurdles ahead between now and exit from the pandemic? You're still on mute, Kate.
Sorry, keep forgetting to do that. Short term, I see many hurdles. I think, you know, it's a question of survivability and how we can get businesses through the next 2-3 months, some of the toughest months of the year that we would normally go into. Longer term, if we get through sort of February, I can see that the optimism returning there, and more positivity coming through as a result of COVID, the vaccines, the mass testing, a sort of exit strategy beginning to emerge. But I think that hibernation period is going to be very difficult.
And actually, just linked to that, sorry, two other questions, but linked. Is there any evidence? Are you picking up sort of vibes from Europe in terms of likely levels of demand? I mean, is there pent-up demand in Europe, people wanting to come to the UK as soon as they're able to for leisure purposes?
Yeah, the sentiment research that Britain does with international markets is quite positive. I think in particular, there's pent-up demand in our highest value markets, the Far East, the Middle East and America. There's a desire to be able to come as soon as they're able to without restrictions. And then, you know, the European, I mean, they're short haul markets and they're short breaks. There is an appetite to come back. There is a demand. And equally, there's a demand within our own population to be able to go and have a break as soon as they're able to, both domestically and obviously they'll go overseas as well. But, you know, the appetite for staycations seems as strong as ever. So I do think there's longer term optimism if we can get the quarantine right, if we can get the testing regime right. And crucially, if our governments can start talking positively. I think that's our biggest challenge collectively, is to get them to start talking positively about hospitality and tourism being a safe place to go, and that you know, they might have put restrictions on what we can do, but that's not because we're inherently unsafe. And that's what we need to get them focused on the next 2 months, so that when we do come out of this, there is that positive approach towards resuming trading and resuming normal activities.
And do you think, final question from me, do you think the government really understand and appreciate the impact they're having on the hospitality sector, or do they just see it as being an inevitable cost of the crisis?
I think they see and understand the impact. I don't think they fully understand it, and I don't think they fully get cash flow. Certainly they have no idea and no comprehension of a high volume, low margin cash business, and the dynamics of our seasons and our seasonality. I think they understand. I think they are trying their very hardest to be able to avoid that damage and to minimize it as much as possible within the constraints within which they're operating. And it's quite clear that there is quite a battle at the heart of the UK government between those who are wanting to prioritize public health versus the economy, and the economy has lost out. And unfortunately, we are the big losers in that. So I think there is recognition of our importance for growth to come back. Unfortunately, politicians across all the devolved administrations see us as being a self-healing industry. You know, they see us as being quite resilient. They see us as being a resilient, an industry that will bounce back. You may well lose businesses, you may well lose jobs, but those jobs will resume. They will come through in different businesses. Demand will return. And so, you know, I don't think they quite get how deep the damage will be this time around.
That's quite an interesting term, a self-healing industry. I haven't heard that one before, but I kind of can see exactly what you're saying. Kate, thank you so much. You're an absolute star, and we're all hugely appreciative. I'm sure we can all give you a little bit of applause. So thank you very much indeed. Please do come back and join us perhaps in a few weeks as the crisis sort of unfolds, or hopefully we start to see a bit more bright light at the end of the tunnel. Next week, we've got Paul Charles, who's leading the Quash Quarantine campaign, who'll be joining us, who's always a fascinating commentator, particularly on travel and the impact on hotel sector. And we also have Aggie coming back from Hotstats to provide the latest on what I'm sure will be rather gloomy performance statistics for the hospitality sector and the hotel sector in particular. So thank you again, one and all, for joining us. I think we had a record turnout today, which is no surprise whatsoever when we had Kate and, of course, Mark on. Thank you again, Kate, and we'll look forward to welcoming you back at some stage in the not too distant future.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'd be delighted to return. So in the meantime, I hope everybody trades as well as they're able to, and can get through this as well as they're able to. And we're here for support if you need us.
Thank you very much indeed, Kate. Thank you to you all. Thank you to Mark, and thank you for the individual contributions. Very much appreciated.
Thank you, Roddy. Cheers.
All the very best, everybody. Stay safe.
Thanks, Roddy.
Pleasure, Charles. Lovely to see you as ever.
And you. God bless. Bye.
Take care.
Yeah, and you.
David, I'll just hang on there for a moment. David, I'll give you a call in 2 minutes if that's okay.